So I am so pleased to introduce to you Sophia Lopez. She has personally experienced and survived, are you ready for this? Tornadoes in Texas, hurricanes in Georgia and Louisiana, snowstorms in eastern Washington, and earthquakes in Hawaii. Sophia was a preparedness expert long before discovering she could major in it, let alone dedicate her life to it. She received a master's in Homeland Security Studies from Tulane University. She is a certified emergency manager with almost 10 years of practical experience in emergency management and has over 20 years of experience in customer service. She's served on multiple deployments and activations, including supporting the USDA with the avian influenza outbreak in 2015, as the documentation lead and serving as the logistics section chief for King County COVID-19 response in 2020. She's worked in emergency management as a volunteer, a student, and in private and public industry, and has been a public educator in disaster preparedness for over 7 years. She currently serves as the community engagement manager in the City of Seattle Office of Emergency Management. So I think you can see she has tremendous expertise to share with us disaster preparedness, the basics. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure and honor to get to be here and to kick off the spring series for this program. You know, when we talk about disaster preparedness, and this type of work that you'll be doing, it's really important to make sure that you're ready at home so that you can, in the event of an unexpected disastrous, incident, you can be able to be okay and comfortable and confident that your home life is in order. So then you can turn around and do the job that it is you will be doing. We actively, as civil servants, as public servants, we all understand that there's work to be done, even during after hours, even during routine events, as well as during disastrous events. And so I'm hopeful that today we'll talk through a lot of some basic concepts for you to take home for yourself as well, in addition to applying it to the work that you'll be doing, specifically to the audience you'll be working with as older adults. Barbara, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I do take this to heart, the work that I do, mostly because I know what it feels like to not understand what's happening, to not know what the hazards were, to not be ready, and also to not have English is my second language. It's not my primary language. And so a lot of the incidents the disasters that I have survived were in part with coming together as a community, as well as being able to support my parents who didn't really understand some of the messaging that was coming through. So we'll kick off. We live and or work in the city of Seattle, and unbeknownst to many of us, because it is a beautiful place to live for about 3 months out of the year, and the rest of the time we love it anyways, even if it's raining or windy or cold or warm. But in Seattle, we are prone to a number of disasters, a number of hazards that we've identified. So in-house, we have a process that we undergo where we look at it's called the Seattle Hazard Identification and Vulnerability Analysis. And through this effort, we look at what are the different natural and human caused events that could impact life and infrastructure within the city. And we also expand that because we understand that disasters, they don't know boundaries. They don't understand city limits. And so we have a very integral relationship that we've been building regionally as well, because we know that when the unexpected occurs, we will be impacted, and we'll most likely will need to rely on outside sources for support. So one of the very first steps to kind of getting this in your radar, kind of absorbing what you're about to learn, is first knowing what is it that you are at risk for. So we've identified 18 hazards that could impact the city of Seattle in one facet or another, whether it's directly impactful, such as an earthquake on the Seattle fault line, which runs right underneath I-90, and as well as other locations. So the Seattle fault is actually 3 different lines, and one of them is underneath I-90. Another one goes through, I believe, Tacoma, and then there's another one to the north of us through Bainbridge Island. But those all make up the Seattle fault. And so we know that an earthquake is our absolute worst case scenario. And even though they don't happen every day, that you can feel, that community members and residents can feel, we know they do happen every day. And there will be a moment when the big one will happen, and it will be devastating to the community. So if you're prepared for the worst case scenario, then you're prepared for just about anything. We also look at these hazards, and it's important to understand that there's a lot of cascading effects that can happen. So for example, a windstorm could be very strong and it could cause power outage to be out for a certain amount of time, but it can also lead to down power lines, down trees, which causes an infrastructure damage. So we're looking at some of the things we would be doing would be clearing the roads, communicating with our energy providers to provide them whatever resources they need to be able to get things back up and running. But on your end, on the end of a care provider or an individual that lives or works within the city of Seattle that could be at risk for these, it's just important to know which one of these specifically would you be a primary at risk for, and which ones could impact other elements of your world. We don't harp too much on the science behind earthquake, but it is important to know that there are 3 types of earthquakes that could impact us here in the city. We have the crustal, shallow quakes. Those are the ones that happen more frequently than not. We can't feel them, but it's perfectly normal, where the earth is constantly pushing up, plates are pushing against each other, which causing and leading to a release of gases. It's all very normal, natural occurrences. Then we have the deep quakes, where we might see a different kind of breakage or slip between the plates. Some slips are a little more vertical, and some slips go horizontally. And so the deep quakes, we've seen those recently in the news, the quake that affected Turkey and Syria, quakes that have affected California and Alaska. We have been pretty fortunate since in my time here, since 2015, to not have yet experienced a massive quake, but that's not to say that it can't happen or that it won't happen in our lifetime. And then there's the third quake, which is the biggest quake that we could experience. Is called a megathrust or a subduction zone quake. Years ago, there was a publication, The New Yorker, that put out an article highlighting the impact that level of earthquake could have, and covering how in the year 1700, we know from looking at data, geographical mapping, looking at other countries' records, historical records of experiences that happened in Japan, we know that in the year 1700, there was a 10.0 mega earthquake that took place on the Cascadia Fault. And the Cascadia Fault, if you look at the picture, it's where the Juan de Fuca plate meets the North Atlantic plate. And that's that red line that has a highlight subduction zone earthquakes. And those are the quakes that happen every 300 to 600 years. So one caveat to the New Yorker article was that it did highlight a very important and necessary hazard to the area. However, it also did what media is supposed to do, and it made things a little bit worse, more far off than they possibly could be. Are we overdue? Not necessarily. We have entered a window of time, a window of 300 years. So can it happen tomorrow? Absolutely. Can it happen 100 years from tomorrow? Absolutely. And the fact that is a real thing, a real risk that can impact us, is why we work so hard to change our culture, to make planning for incidences such as this that could impact your daily routine as a top priority, to make it second nature. So as we know, we need to get life insurance, or we need to get car insurance, we need to buckle up, we need to follow certain rules that came out of times in history where they weren't mandated. We're not in a period yet where preparedness is mandated, but we're hopeful to get to a point where community resiliency building is become more second nature to members of the public. People don't meet their neighbors anymore, and it's something that we're hopeful to bring it back more into normal happenings, because we know that communities have a higher rate of making it through a worst case scenario than individuals. So this is a little bit about earthquakes. More specifically, there are two tools that you can use individually, or you can use in the work that you're doing if you find yourself supporting clients or patients. And this is something that might be beneficial for an individual you work with to know. They are currently web-based. So we have our Hazard Explorer, which has recently been translated into Spanish. And that location is where you can see the variety of hazards and locations throughout the city where they are at the higher or lower end as far as the risk goes. And on hazardready.org/Seattle, you can punch in your physical address, and it can be where you live, where you work, wherever you frequent. As long as it's within King County boundaries, that is the maximum of that resource. It's a joint effort across the city of Seattle and King County. And it is currently undergoing an update as well as is translated. And that's where you can see in your lifetime, are you at a low, medium, or high threat level for any number of hazards. So you would type in your address, and there's a few tabs related to the different hazards that I just showed you. And then it'll tell you, maybe you live in a flood inundation zone and you're not aware of that. You weren't aware when you moved there. Or maybe you live right over the Seattle fault, or maybe your biggest threat is landslides, and you might not even realize that you live in an area that could be prone to landslides. So this is step one in the planning process, finding out what is it specifically that you need to prepare for, where you live, where you work, where you reside, and how can this information help inform how you live your life, whether it's conversations you have with your family, a planning component. So a quick story, when I lived in Louisiana, I learned very quickly, literally my first week there, I learned that I would have to have gas in my car all the time. And so it's something that I adopted in the 5 years that I lived there, and I carry with me today, 7, 8 years after I've left the state of Louisiana. Half a tank is my new empty. It was a change, a shift I had to make mentally and physically to view my fuel as a resource. And I don't want to be getting in line to get fuel if the message is to get out of town. And I don't want to be getting in line to get out of town after hundreds upon hundreds of people have already taken that step. And now I'm at the back of the line. So little things like that is kind of where we're hoping we start to see a shift. The more classes that we provide, the more folks that we work with, such as yourself, and empower you to go out, and when you're doing the work that you'll be doing, remembering some of these concepts and maybe applying it into the work that you do. So these are two tools that are readily available, free to use. And then we're constantly working on getting them updated and making sure we have more languages represented. But it's a harsh reality that it's, a lot of folks wouldn't expect someone in government to just be blunt about, but as somebody who's survived and knows exactly what this feels like, this is the one place I feel like I should be allowed to be blunt about it. We know that people aren't going to be able to get to places as easily as they can in a blue sky event. So as individuals who would be working with older adults who might have transportation capabilities that they don't have access to, or they might heavily rely on transportation to get to doctor's appointments, to get to dialysis appointments, to get groceries, whatever the case is, knowing that in a worst case scenario, roads, access to transportation capabilities will become limited, if non-existent. We know that looking at the city of Seattle alone, there are a number of areas we've identified that would, in effect, become islands. And some of that, we're actually undergoing a proactive effort right now on how to turn these islands and create interconnectedness through the metaphorical building bridges. We have a whole team of individuals that are actively working within the community to try to make sure that these areas that could find themselves, in effect, cut off from services, from resources, just merely based on how the bridges lie or the roads lie, or where the damage is highest. So keeping that in mind, knowing that you have clients and you have your routes and you know how to get from point A to point B, how can you keep doing that in the event of a major up change to your routine. So being mindful that we're going to be wanting to have the roads clear, mostly because we'll need emergency providers to be able to get from point A to point B a lot easier than if we just had everybody out there trying to drive around. It's not going to be as easy as it is today. There might be transit stops that are completely wiped out. So on our end, behind the scenes, we're actively working to identify what are some ways that we can mitigate the hazard when this happens. And our goal is to empower more individuals like yourself to have this information, to know the reality, and to take some actions today so that when it happens, you have your backup. So I know how to walk from my place of residence to my place of work. I also know how to get from my place of residence to the other side of the mountains, Eastern Washington. And that's a part of my plan because that my family's in Eastern Washington and I have pets. And so one of the first things I would need to do is make sure that my pets are taken care of, make sure that my family is aware. And if I happen to be on that side of the island, my priority will be to come back. I'll be one of the crazy people who's trying to come back into the damaged zone because I have a job to do. But just understanding that transportation specifically, I think would be a direct impact to a lot of the clients you would be servicing, but also knowing grocery stores are going to run out of supplies. This happened in Snowmageddon, February 8th, 2019. I was teaching a class very similar to this, but I was working for the county and I was in North Bend. And I remember on the way to class, I had a partner who was supporting outreach with me. He stopped at the grocery store and he took pictures that we were able to inject that night into the slide deck to show and demonstrate just the night before a major snow event, grocery stores were already out of vegetables, cleaned out, completely empty produce sections. When I was living in Georgia, I lived on an army base where you would not think you would have a struggle, but it turned out 3 hours away from us, there was a major hurricane striking the panhandle of Florida, and it came onto land and it caused power outage for where we were living for 7 days. And one of my oldest memories is going with my mother to a grocery store, and on an army base, there's a commissary and there's a mini mall or a shopette, which is equivalent of a gas station. That was the closest we could get to. One loaf of bread on the shelf. One loaf of bread. And that image is burned in my brain, looking down a bread aisle, and there is nothing. Everything is just ransacked. Everything is taken except for one loaf of bread. And we happen to get that last loaf of bread. But it's a scary situation to find yourselves in, especially for my mom, who nobody wants to be that person to take the last thing of something. But when you have family to care for, when you have loved ones, and when you feel like your life is on the line, you do what you can to survive. And so simply just knowing that, as you're talking with your clients or as you're working with your own family, what is it that you like to eat or need to eat? What dietary restrictions might an individual have? And those are some items that person should try to set aside, even one little bit here and there as they financially can afford, but being mindful that grocery stores will run out of supplies quickly. What are some long-term shelf life items that an individual can invest in, can purchase, can set aside so that it has a long expiration date away and it can be okay for a certain amount of time. We're so reliant on utilities. So one of the things that we actually teach in addition to this basic class is how to build an emergency toilet. Mostly because we know in the worst case scenario, odds are utilities will be damaged, whether it's electricity, water, sewage main. We're going to see some difficulty in being able to utilize our normal occurring services. And we're all human beings. We all have to go to the restroom. And so we have, if you just have a bucket, some kitty litter, and a garbage bag, you've got yourself a makeshift toilet right there. There's some other elements to it when we provide our class, but it's just something to be mindful of. How do we keep doing the things that we are used to doing or that we physically have a need to do in the wake of an unexpected disastrous event? gas stations and ATM machines. We saw in Hurricane Katrina, credit cards machines weren't working, ATMs weren't working, gas ran out very quickly. And that's why it's very important to think of these things. And like just today, right now, I'm hopeful by the end of the day, you'll have one thing, at least one thing in mind that you can do for yourself, and then keep some elements of this for you as you progress through the series, as you progress through your careers, and how can this information inform the work you do when you're working with other people, especially older adults or individuals with access and functional needs. Hospitals will become overwhelmed. That is going to happen. So sometimes part of the conversation could be, what are some actions that individuals can take today? Maybe taking a first aid class, maybe even just learning. We have trainings that we offer called Stop the Bleed, which we're really excited. We just got into the Seattle school districts, but I'm still, it's a long haul, but the goal is to eventually get as many people trained in this type of response training, where if sometimes the difference between life and death is just applying pressure on a bleeding wound. And so if somebody knows that, then even if they find themselves the individual with the bleeding wound, they can save their own life by applying pressure on their wound. But understanding that hospitals are going to be overwhelmed, we don't want people to not call 911. We want you to call 911, but we just need you to understand that they will be prioritizing life safety calls. And hospitals will be overwhelmed. And it could quite possibly be days before you see somebody, a firefighter, a police officer, or you might see them, but they drive right past you because they have routes that they have to drive across first at the onset of something to determine where the resources need to be allocated. We're so dependent on our cell phones. How many of you can honestly say you have a phone number memorized? 2 phone numbers, 5 phone numbers. I have my immediate family members' phone numbers memorized, with the exception of 2, because they keep changing their phone numbers, but I write them down. So we have materials that we can provide. I'll make sure that Barbara has digital copies, and if you want some physical ones, I can get some to you as well. But we have documents that people can use to actually write down the names of their loved ones and their phone numbers, because whether it's your phone or someone else's phone, someone who might have a charge, or even if you're getting a message through somebody who uses a ham radio, having that contact information written down, because in the worst case scenario, we're undergoing high stress. Even if you know it by heart today, that's not to say you will be able to remember it with ease when you need it. So advocating that people write information down, keeping that information stored somewhere safely, and understanding that responders are going to be out there getting it to you as fast as they can, as efficiently as they can, but there are so many more of you than there are of them. And the best that we can do right now is to prepare as many people as possible, just with the knowledge that these are some things that can happen. These are some things that we know will no longer function in a worst case scenario. So these are some questions you should ask yourself today during blue sky, as opposed to during day 7 of a long-term power outage. I always tell people, you don't want to meet your neighbors for the first time on day 7 of a long-term power outage. Today is the day to meet your neighbors, introduce yourself, especially older adults. There's a program that is recently getting retired and replaced with a different program, but it was called Map Your Neighborhood. And the base premise of it was meeting your neighbors and mapping the circumstances of your neighborhood, whether you have somebody who lives alone, maybe they have a pet, maybe you have a neighbor who's in a wheelchair, maybe you have a neighbor who is an older adult or an older couple, maybe you have a retired nurse in your neighborhood or a retired architect. These are skill sets. These are conditions and circumstances that someone should be mindful of. And the idea behind that program and other programs similar to it, ours in Seattle is called SNAP, Seattle Neighborhoods Actively Prepare. The idea is that you will very well be your own first care provider, and a neighbor could very well be your first care provider, or you could be theirs, because the first people you will see will be other people in similar circumstances as you. So just understanding and knowing that, how can we adopt this into our conversation, into the work that we do, all part of creating this culture shift. So we've identified our hazards. We know some realities of what could happen in the worst case scenario, or what we will be without. The next step would be to develop a plan. Now, everyone's plan will be unique. It'll be different from anyone else's because we all have unique circumstances. I take medication that I cannot stop taking at the drop of a dime. I have to have a month's supply. And so I had to take steps for myself on how can I get that supply when I can't get refills. I can't get my prescriptions refilled that much in advance. And so what I do is, and I share this, and there's probably another slide where it'll come up, but I'm a big fan of repeating things at least 3 times to help retention. So what I do, and I share this tip because as individuals who will be working with older adults, I could see this question coming up a lot. How do you get your medication refilled? Right now at the state level, the State Pharmaceutical Association, they are having this conversation. How can we change or make policy decisions today to better support our customers and individuals that have medical needs? And so with the medicine specifically, I refill as soon as I can, and I start my new bottle. And I never finish the old bottle. Instead, I take what's left in the old bottle and I set it aside into my emergency supply. And I do that every time. As soon as I can refill, I refill. So I generally have at least a week's supply on my person, in addition to the day of and a couple of days after. And at home, I have a whole month's supply of everything I take. Everything I take that has prescriptions, in addition to supplements. Supplements, it's easier because you can just buy them. But it's easier said than done. Not everybody has that financial capabilities to just be able to have a stock up of all the supplements you take. And so what are some questions specific to you as individuals, but also these are some questions for you to take back to whenever you get to wherever you're going in your professional careers. These are good considerations to have. Who depends on you and what do they need to make it through an unexpected event? That event could be a car accident. And I think it was the year 2016, I had just moved here. And I remember in the news on I-5, there was an 8-hour delay. Can you imagine being stuck in your car on I-5 for 8 hours and you can see your exit in eyeshot? It was because of a 10-car pileup that involved a semi-truck. Traffic was stalled for 8 hours. Back to bumper. And all I keep thinking of, how many people are diabetic? How many people have bladder issues, or they can't hold it for that long? How many people have little ones at home waiting for them for dinner or to be even let into the house, whatever the circumstances? So the event could be the worst case earthquake, catastrophic. Now the city's broken down into islands, or it could be something mundane, something that just you took the wrong exit and now you find yourself at the tail end of traffic and you're not going to make it on time. What is your backup plan? So it's always good to look at your situation. How will you come together with your family? Who depends on you? And what do they need to make it through? So we talked about how routes are going to be disrupted. So what are some alternate routes from home and to work, but also from home to your nearest grocery store, from home to the hospital? If you had to walk it, what would that look like today? Doing it today, downloading, we have the capabilities now in Google Maps. You can download routes and have them available offline, so you don't need internet to access them. And so other questions to ask yourself, if you have little ones in your life, or if you have older adults that you take care of right now, what are the plans for their work, for their schools, for their daycare? And do you have equipment that requires electricity? So if that's the case, and you have equipment that requires electricity, what is the backup plan should you lose electricity for 12 hours, 24 hours, 7 days? So that's a very plausible reality that could happen. And then we talked a little bit about no water service. I mean, we're basic humans. We have not basic humans. Nobody's basic here, but we're human beings. We have basic needs, whether it's, we can probably be fine without showering, but we will have to use the restroom. We will have to disinfect. We might have to clean wounds. We will have to cook food. We'll have to figure out how to stay hydrated ourselves. And so these are some questions that the goal is to kind of help prompt discussion within a family or a unit, or even just individuals. What are your specific needs, and how can you start making some preparations today before something happens? Communications is going to be critical. Communicating your status to your loved ones, communicating to your place of work, or even just communicating that you're okay or you need help. So text messaging is the best option. Not everybody can text message. Not everyone is comfortable with sending a text. And so one of the things that I always advocate, especially when I'm working with older adults, is to learn how to send a text, even if it's something short. And actually, it should be short, simple, and to the point. The reason being is that text messaging requires a very minimal, little to no bandwidth, as opposed to a phone call that requires a significant amount more bandwidth and connectivity to actually work. So we don't want people clogging up the phone lines because they're already going to be damaged to a certain extent. We need to keep those phone lines as clear as possible for responders. But we do want people to be able to communicate with each other. I'm on a multiple number of text messaging groups across family, across friends. I also have social media chat groups that I'm a part of across family, across friends, just in case social media is up for some reason. I have connectivity. I can post something that says I'm okay, or I'm trapped, or I need assistance, or I don't. One of the things I did when I first moved here was I established an out-of-state contact. And that's, it's easier said than done. Not everybody has someone out of state, but even if you have someone out of the area. So my family in Eastern Washington, I would probably be able to contact them, but just as a precaution, I contacted my aunt in El Paso, Texas. And I confirmed with her that she was my out of area contact. And once a year, every year on her birthday, I call her to tell her happy birthday, but also to reaffirm that when something happens in Seattle that is major, my family is not even going to try to call or text me. They are immediately going to check in with her, and I will check in with her out of state, and I will send her a text message. So we practice, we text with each other, and then my parents will text her, and it's just this little kind of triangle. It's our out of area contact. So I will reach out to her, and they will see my status from talking to her until things kind of pass, a little more time passes and we see some services coming back up and running. But the whole idea is to avoid making phone calls. And so what are some ways today that you can establish communicating with your family, whether it's making sure that everyone knows even the plan if you can't reach each other? Where are we going to come together or reunite? If we're separated or we find ourselves unable to, we're not together when something happens, what's a mutual meeting spot? And then who are some other alternates that we can reach out to and that can serve as our alternate point of contact? A lot of folks ask this question about insurance. We've seen it a lot, especially during COVID. We know that there are government assistance programs. We know this, and probably more members of the public are now more familiar with it in light of COVID. But what's really important to take home from this is that this is not something an individual should rely upon or count on. This is kind of where we get into we wish at some point it would be a mandatory thing similar to how car insurance is, but we're very much far from there. But it's just good to know the fine print, to understand that when you look at homeowners insurance or renters insurance, flooding is more often than not covered. But there's a difference between rising water and falling water, and that is highlighted and broken down. So there's flood insurance needs to be purchased through the National Flood Insurance Program, but that's rising water as opposed to falling water. And there's also a difference between you have flooding as a result of a water main break versus flooding as a result of a natural hazard. So know the fine details. You might have clients that you work with that ask these questions, or that comes up in conversation that, oh, they'll rely on that. And this is an opportunity for you to share with them, that's actually not something you should rely on. You should look at what do you need specifically and what are some other options today before something major happens. You might have heard this message, and there used to be this nationwide message. It was have a plan, build a kit, take action. We will still advocate that people build a kit, but it's important to know, like I mentioned, everyone's kits, everyone's plans will be unique to them. What do you need to make it through an unexpected event? Who depends on you, and what do they need to make it through? So we advocate at least 14 days. It used to be 3 days, then it was 7 to 10 days. Now we know it's a harsh reality, but realistically, you could quite possibly be looking at weeks. So I like to tell people, imagine you're going to go camping. What would you need to be okay comfortably camping for 14 days? It might not be the most comfortable. We're not talking glamping, but thinking about, I'm going to go camping for 14 days. And this could be a fun activity, not to get your family's hopes up of an actual camping trip, but just to have that conversation. What would we need to be okay for 14 days? Do we have everything we need? And if we don't, how can we plan to get up to the point where we could be okay? I just always tell people, I understand that there's communities out there that are barely struggling to put food on the table that week, let alone planning for 2 weeks of an unknown time, an unknown place in history when something catastrophic could happen. So I always just say, any little bit you do is that much more than doing nothing at all. And just know that you should be doing something, even if it's something small. Even if, for me, if I find myself with cash, I break it down. I keep one small bills. I keep it in my car, I keep it in my purse. I keep it in my kit at home. And that's where my cash goes. I don't spend cash. If I happen to get cash in some way, shape, or form, whether I withdrawed it from the bank or I paid for something and I have change or whatever the situation is, but I hoard cash. Like a dragon hoards gold, I hoard cash. Small bills. But I think of my medication. I think of my pets. What do my pets need? I used to have a bearded dragon, and the bearded dragons, and similar to other reptiles, they have a need for high heat. How can I provide that in the event of a power outage? So those are circumstances specific to me. I travel to Eastern Washington a lot. I work in the city of Seattle, but I don't live in the city of Seattle. I commute in. So my car has a number of items, from flashlights, blankets, first aid kits, canned goods, kitty litter, a variety of I even have clothing, extra clothes and shoes in my car, just in case. It's my just in case kit. My own purse is a backpack because I have a number of, my backup medicine, I have lotion, I have tissues because I have nasal issues. These are my circumstances. So think about you. What do you use every day? And when you talk to people, especially when we're working with older adults, what do you use every day? That is what you should first, for starters, start setting aside some items for your emergency kit. So what do you use on a daily basis, putting that in your kit and keeping something at work and in your car, even if something small as a first aid kit and a flashlight. If you know that you travel a lot, you might want to invest a little bit more into your car and not necessarily at your place of work, but don't neglect that because you could be at the office when something happens. This is kind of a little bit more detail on that emergency toilet, the emergency sanitation station. But ultimately, if you have a bucket and you have a garbage bag and you have some kitty litter, you now have a makeshift toilet. I always advocate that people go that extra step. Every individual in the house can have their own styrofoam pool noodle. And that's an insulated styrofoam noodle looking item. If you cut a slit down the center of it, and then fit it to the rim of the bucket, you now have your own toilet seat. Everybody in the house can have their own toilet seat. We always advocate for 2 buckets, one for poo, one for pee, and then designate a location. So as the bucket fills over the course of days, however many people in your household to make that determination, but as the bucket fills, you'll have to empty it. So just gathering up the bag, tying it off, and setting it in a designated location that is not easily accessible by animals. But it's not something that you want to just dump the liquid into the lawn, because that can impact your lawn as well as we don't want people dumping urine in their lawns or digging holes and burying it. So having a designated place, making sure to have some, don't forget the toilet paper. We definitely don't want to relive the toilet paper incident of 2020, but it is a priceless commodity. It will become probably once again a priceless commodity. So these are just some basic elements of having something like that. And people think, well, where should I put it? And I always just tell people, just put it right there in your bathroom. That's already a bathroom. And so again, everyone's situation will be different. But this is just one of the many skills that we can teach people so that when the worst case happens, they're prepared for this element. I talked already about medication, but I would just like to reiterate, trying to have a backup supply of your medicine will be very important, especially if you take certain medications that are for your life safety. And so I've had participants tell me that they cannot get their medicine refilled more than a day or two out. Some don't even get that much. And so in that circumstance, have that conversation with your pharmacist, with your health provider. What are your options? And so this would be a conversation you can have with your patients, with your clients. What are their options? What are considerations they need to take for themselves with regards to food, dietary needs, power supply for medical equipment? Not everybody can afford a generator. So maybe in that circumstance, it's meeting your neighbor and seeing if someone already has a generator, and building that relationship now, today, as opposed to after an event has already taken place. So when the ground starts to shake, in effect, you're experiencing an earthquake. And I don't just mean a light rumble. That could also be it, but a lot of things can cause the ground to be a light rumble. We know during one of the Seattle Seahawks games where Marshawn Lynch did a massive touchdown, and I think it was called like something boom, sonic boom. Anyways, that day, an earthquake registered on the Richter scale at UW. At the University of Washington has a seismology department where they're constantly monitoring. And it was a football game cheering, the crowd so loud that it registered an earthquake. So sometimes the shaking could be just that, a light rumble, a small earthquake, or a large truck passing by. But when we talk about the Seattle fault shake or the Cascadia rising shake, we're talking a solid 3 to 5 minutes of shaking, depending on where the earthquake is. And it could be less than 3 minutes, it could be more, but just understanding that wherever you are, when the ground starts to shake, you want to drop to the ground, drop cover and hold. I provided a link to Barbara, so I'll make sure she's going to make sure you get it, but there's a link to a pictogram, an infographic that was developed to teach drop, cover, and hold, but for people who use a cane, who use a walker, or who find themselves using a wheelchair. And that comes in, for me, that my dad needs a wheelchair. So whenever we're traveling or we're doing long distance events, he has his wheelchair. When we're just in my home, he has his walker. And every time I go over the steps, if the ground starts to shake, he needs to sit in the walker and lock it and tuck and cover his neck and his head. And the goal is you're protecting your vital organs. So we talk about with the walker and we talk about with his wheelchair. And when he's using the cane, for individuals who use a cane, use the cane to help leverage yourself to get down to the ground. But ultimately, the goal is to get to the ground if you can and curl in a ball and protect your vital organs. You're holding on to the legs of a table. If you can get under a table, you want to hold on to the legs because the shaking will shake the table out from over you. So you drop to the ground. If you can get under a table, and I mean 2 steps, 2 seconds, 2 steps, then get under the table and hold on to the legs of the table. But if a table is further away from you, then you can make it in 2 steps. Do not try. You have a higher risk of injuring yourself further if you try to move once the shaking has started. If you want to scare yourself, there are a lot of videos out there where you can actively see just from security cam footage what it was like in a shaking event. I've experienced a shaking event. I actually thought that I was experiencing vertigo because it was very early in the morning and I was living on an island. And in the restroom situation, I was in my friend's home and their restroom was actually a separate building outside. And I remember because I was barefoot and I was walking from their main house to the other house where they had the washer and dryer and a restroom, it was own little building. And I'm walking up a few steps when all of a sudden, 5 hours away from me, And then 50 miles off of the coast of the Big Island of Hawaii, 5 hours away from me, there was a major earthquake. I think it broke 6.0 on the Richter scale. And we were out of power and communication capabilities for 12 hours. But for that first 30 seconds, I didn't know I was in an earthquake until I turned around and I watched the house move. And I watched hundreds upon hundreds of acres of trees sway in unison. And I realized there's an earthquake. This is an earthquake. This is an earthquake. And I still think about it like, oh, and I remember it was the longest 30 seconds. It wasn't that long though, but it was the longest 30 seconds of my life. And it wasn't until, I couldn't open my eyes until my friends I could hear them calling me from inside the house, wondering where was Sophie? And they had to come and get me because I was right along a rock wall that had started to break and I was terrified to move. And so not everyone has that experience, and I get that. But sometimes I think hearing about it, and if it helps and you want to watch the videos, you can. I don't, they're not the greatest, they're not the most pleasant, but sometimes you have to see it to really know, oh, wow, yeah, I really shouldn't try to move when the shaking starts at all. And so the shaking starts, drop where you are. If you're by a table, get underneath the table. If you're not by a table, that's okay. Avoid glass. So if you find that you're near a large wall of glass, I would drop to the ground and probably start crawling away from the glass. But once you're down on the ground, that's where you kind of have more control over your body and the movement, and try to, protect your vital organs. If you're outside, stay outside. If you're inside, stay inside. And then above all, once upon a time, there was a message to get in the doorway. That is not an acceptable message any longer. It came out of the 80s where there was a major earthquake in Mexico, and they noticed that all of the door frames of the buildings that did crumble, the door frames were standing. So that it kind of started this theory that, oh, the door frames are the strongest, most sturdiest part of a building. But what wasn't taken into consideration were that buildings in Mexico were built to a completely different standard, different code, different materials than the buildings in the United States. And so slowly over the years, over the decades, that message has become more and more realized to not actually be an accurate message nor safe. Because of the fact that our doors are, especially in industrial buildings, they're designed to slam shut. You don't want to find yourself in the middle of a doorway in a major shaking event where a door is going to slam shut on you, either knocking you down or closing on your fingers. But I always reiterate, people outside who don't know to stay outside are going to try to run inside. And people inside who don't know to stay inside are going to try to run outside. And you do not want to find yourself in the middle of either of those groups of individuals. So thankfully, today, when the shaking starts, drop to the ground, get under a table if you can, and hold the legs of the table until the shaking stops. And once the shaking stops, then you can stand up, check on you, and make sure you're okay. Because if you're not okay, you can't help others. And then I'll make sure, Barbara will make sure you get access to the, it's a pictogram that is in English and Spanish. And it's a whole accessibility page for earthquake safety by the Earthquake Country Alliance out of California. Once an earthquake has occurred, check on yourself. If you find that you're at home, check on your loved ones, make sure that your home is okay. And then if you're so willing to do the next step, we would ask that individuals go and check on others, check on your neighbors. Maybe you have a neighbor and they have a pet and that they work. So maybe a conversation you could have with your neighbor today is that, hey, what's your backup plan if something happens? Who's going to take care of your pets? Do you have something like that? I would be able to help if you needed help, or vice versa. And just learning more information. Where I have some more resources that I'll make sure to leave with you so that you have access to different ways to stay informed. If you use natural gas, or if you have neighbors, or if this conversation comes up, there are 3 things to remember if you have a natural gas. If you smell rotten egg, if you hear a hissing sound, or if the dial on the meter is spinning rapidly. Those are 3 indicators that you have a natural gas leak. And you would want to turn off your natural gas to keep that from blowing up, literally, quite literally, or from causing further damage. So there are tools. There's a wrench, even if you have just a wrench handy or buried beside your natural gas meter, or hanging right by the door and marked for natural gas meter, you can shut off your own natural gas. It's very easy to turn it off. Excuse me, turning it back on is not as easy. So it's very important to have that conversation with your loved ones. Know how to turn it off. Recognize when and how to turn it, when you should turn it off. But keep in mind that if it's the dead of winter, or if it's a severe cold event on top of something that has caused you to have a natural gas leak, turning it back on will not be as easy. We do not encourage residents to turn on their natural gas by themselves, because turning it off shuts off all of the pilot lights. And unless you have someone who knows exactly where every single pilot light in your home is and knows how to turn it on at the exact same time, there's like a whole method to getting a natural gas turned on. So I always advocate to have the conversation with your provider. Realistically, you could be looking at weeks before you could get it turned back on professionally with the natural gas provider. But just knowing how to shut it off could mean a difference between more damage to your unreparable damage to your home. So these are conversations to have within your unit, within your loved ones. How to turn off your water at the main valve. So I have a slide on water coming up next, but water is one of at a bare minimum, when we talk about what do we need for our kit, or what do we need to plan for, at the bare minimum, you need three things. You need food, you need water, and you need clothing or shelter, layers, warmth. And so when we think about water, we already have in our home 50 to 55 gallons of potable water. Normally I would say, raise your hands, what do you think it is? But for the most part, I would hope you already know, it's the hot water tank. Your hot water heater is about 50 to 55 gallons of water already there, stored, ready to go. Knowing how to turn off your water at the main valve, at the main street level, could help protect that water from getting contaminated from whatever's happening outside of your home. So you want to know how to do that, to shut off the water inside your house as well as outside. And then understand you have the back of the toilet tank, that's a source of water. If for events that you can see coming, like a storm, like a weather related event that we can see a certain number of hours out. One of the things we used to do in Texas when we knew tornadoes were coming, for the most part, we'd have some level of notice, or large electrical storms, we would fill our bathtubs with water. And the same in Louisiana, when we saw the hurricanes coming, we would fill our bathtubs with water. So there's bags you can buy that shape to form to the shape of your bathtub. And that's just another source of water before something happens. You could start to accumulate water. But just knowing how to turn off your house water could protect the water that you already have inside your home. And then understand, like if you have structural damage, roping off areas, some items that would be good to have in a home kit would be tarps tarps and duct tape, because you might have, if you find that you live or work in an unreinforced masonry building, or any kind, if you have brick or something that is an older house that hasn't been retrofitted, you could find that you have whole walls gone. Or complete windows broken completely, and it would take time to get them repaired. So what are some items you can invest in today to help make your camping situation a little more comfortable? With the water, it's a gallon per person per day. This is for everybody. And it's not necessarily that we expect anyone, older adults and children, to drink a gallon of water a day. That's not the case. But the idea is that with a gallon, for an individual, you would have drinking water, cleaning, cooking, sanitary needs, whatever the case is, all of the things we would use water for, it comes out roughly to about a gallon per person per day. But we talked about the sources. So you have your hot water heater, you have the back of the toilet tank, filling up your tub. But in some instances, none of that might work for whatever reasons. So identifying a water source. Now, this can be a little trickier, especially for older adults, if they don't have maybe physical capabilities to prevent them from being able to walk far distances. And that's kind of where it comes back to who is your network? And if you don't have a network or you're not a part of a community, become a part of a community. Your community can be your neighborhood. It can be your book club. It can be a class you take. It can be your church. It can be a knitting club, whatever the case is. It could even just be your own home network. But being a part of a community, meeting people today, taking some classes, all of that can help prepare an individual to make it through an unexpected event. And so identifying a nearest water source and then investing in a purification process. So boiling water is the safest way to purify it. If you get the water boiling to a rolling boil of 3 to 5 minutes, that is the safest way to clean water. However, you cannot boil out chemicals. So trying to boil out pool water or hot tub water isn't going to have the same effect as if you went and got a lake water or a river or stream. And so you can't boil out or clean out with bleach chemically treated water. So that is not an option. But identifying a water source and having a filtration system. There's a company that's called Life Straw, and they create a small straw for the individual. It kind of started marketing to hikers. But that same company created a larger filtration. It looks like a large straw, and it connects to a gravity-fed bucket. And so the bucket and that filter can provide water for a family of 5 for 3 years. And all they need is to identify a water source. So just some tips to take with you, some sources for your toolkit as you progress through your, through the series, through your profession. This is good for you, but it's also good to apply to the work that you might do and the conversations you might have with people. Some fun activities to do in your home. One thing that you could do today, if you're home right now or wherever you find yourself, just scan your property, scan your place of residence. What are some hazards that you identify? Maybe you have baseboard heaters and you have furniture pushed up right against the baseboard heater, or you have long curtains right over a baseboard heater, which is a fire hazard. Again, the event could be the worst case scenario of an earthquake, or it could be something that happens more frequently, such as a fire in a home. The number one location where fires start in the home is the kitchen, and it mostly comes out of individuals who, I don't do this anymore, but I learned to stop doing this when I worked for a fire department. I used to always have dish rag or a towel hanging on my stove, on my oven handle. I don't do that anymore. Mostly because it got drilled out of me, because that is a serious fire hazard, especially if you have pets. Pets can jump on counters willy-nilly. If you're cooking something and you have your handle facing out, you bump it, you've now got oil splashing everywhere, or whatever you're cooking splashing everywhere, and you have, whether you have a gas stove or electric stove, there's just a lot of different factors at play that could result in a fire. So looking at, maybe you want to prepare for the earthquake. So do you have large furniture that is like high located, like bookshelves or stackable washer and dryer? There's furniture strappings. And I always advocate this for older adults so that they don't have to worry about trying to get something heavy lifted in the aftermath of an event. There's furniture strappings that individuals can invest in today, where you can harness down refrigerators, washer and dryers, bookshelves, wall hangings. I had somebody tell me this tip that I love to share. They love to hang stuff up on their wall. And so if you imagine you have a picture, and now she had one wire from corner to corner of her picture that has glass. And that one wire hangs on one nail, and that's it, right? Now in the shaking, that's going to pop off the nail and fall to the ground and crash. But what she did, she took a second wire and she wrapped it around the first wire and the nail itself. So now she has 2 wires and 1 nail, 1 wire on the picture hanging on the nail, and a second wire connecting the nail to the first wire. So when the shaking happens, it will hang with that second wire. I just thought that was brilliant. I'd like to have stuff hanging up on my walls, but nothing has glass. They're all paintings. They're just on canvas. Nothing has glass. And everything, but I do have a lot of knickknacks, and I have glass items that I used to do glass blowing, for example. So all of my items in my home space have museum putty underneath them. That item used to have museum putty. I need to reinstall it. But there's little things that you can invest in that can kind of help secure the things that you care about, whether they're pictures, large furniture items, knickknacks that you collect. And so doing like a home hazard hunt could be a fun family activity, or even a fun activity to do as an exercise. Let's say you have multiple clients, or you're working in assisted living center or long-term care facility, whatever the case is, wherever you find yourself. There's different activities that you can do. This is actually a video, but I don't know if it'll play in this. Oh, it is playing. So I'll let you watch this just for a second. That was a hot water tank that fell. These are cabinets that were not secured. Thankfully, their light fixtures didn't fall, but a whole bunch of other things fell. I hope that played okay. So that was just kind of a little envision what it could be like. And if you
I was
find
going to
yourself with
say, Sophia, I was going to say it played perfect, but that's not really a perfect. It
yeah,
played. It played.
it played. But thinking about, where you live, there's options to retrofit your home. You might find yourself working with clients that have been around for a very long time, and they've been in the same place and they're never going to leave, and that's their place and that's where they're going to live. But we offer a free home retrofit class, and we advocate that people the city has a program where you can apply to see if you can get financial aid for retrofitting. But all of it comes down to your neighborhood. It comes down to helping each other. We know because there have been studies on this. Studies show that communities have a higher rate of recovering faster and smoother, more successful recovery than individuals. So this is just some resources within the city of Seattle. We have our SNAP program, the Seattle Neighborhoods Actively Prepare, but we also work in tandem with an independent organization that exists, which is the Seattle Emergency Communication Hub Network. And the map that you see on your screen right now, those are the blue and white images are active hubs. They're emergency communication hubs. They have captains, they're established, they do drilling and training regularly, and we're actively working to connect more people in those neighborhoods to their hub that already exists. And the goal of the hub is not for emergency supply stock, but it's for information. Through the hub, you would be able to find out who needs batteries, who needs blankets. I need batteries. Where can I get some batteries? Or I would love somebody to look at my house and tell me if it's safe to stay inside or if I should continue camping on my lawn. But information, resources at the community level. These are locations where people might go to put signs up saying, I'm looking for so-and-so, or I have extra supplies, and others can come and see that. They're also connected with our auxiliary communication support. So those are ham radio operators. If you wanted to get a message through and you knew you were connected to your local hub, that would be a way to get a message to, like, I would find my nearest hub in the city because I don't live in the cities, but I would be coming into work and I would ask for help to get a message to my family in Eastern Washington on the chance that I can't even reach my aunt in Texas. So those are the main active hubs. And then the other icon where it looks like a sonic, like a ping, those are pea patches. So in the city, we have gardens space that are designated community gardens. They're called pea patches. A number of those pea patches have been outfitted and turned into community gathering hubs. And those are not necessarily emergency communication hubs, but wherever there's an emergency communication hub, there's a nearby co-located community gathering place that is associated with that pea patch. And so we're currently working to continually update the map. But at that website, there's an interactive map that you can tap into to see where your nearest hub is. And I always advocate that people connect with their nearest hub, especially if you find that you live alone or you have patients that they live alone and they don't really know what they would do in the worst case scenario. Get them connected with their nearest hub, because this is a network of their team. They practice regularly together and they're constantly looking to adopt and absorb more members to expand and make all the more resources available for everybody. We have an emergency notification system in the city of Seattle. And this is a system that wherever you are, we can notify you whether you're signed up or not. But we advocate that people sign up because you can choose to receive certain alerts that we wouldn't push out automatically. So the alerts that we would push out automatically would be critical life safety, protection of infrastructure. Those are the alerts that you might get at all hours of the night, but it's only because something has happened, and we use geolocating capabilities to communicate with anybody within the cell phone range of that location. So we would get people who live there, as well as people who are traveling through an area, to give them an action item, to avoid an area, to boil your water, to seek shelter, whatever the message is. So we have that capability, but we want people to sign up to choose to, you can choose to receive all these other alerts. These are community notifications. So these don't come automatically. They're not geolocated. These are if an individual signs up and they give us their, the information is protected. You can choose if you want to be emailed, texted, called. You can choose to include an address. So for the geolocated alerts, they will, you'll get those. And then we have, whenever we have a class that we offer, people who opt in to the emergency preparedness notification, they would be notified anytime we post a class. So that's just our emergency notification system that we advocate everyone push out and share. And it can come in. Right now, we also have translated messages that are recorded in audio. So if an alert is going out, we have the capability to send it out in a language of that impacted community. In addition to our basic preparedness class, we hold classes in person, and everything that we offer has, we make sure that there's an accessibility element to it. So if somebody requires CART services or ASL, and all the locations that we're going to, we make sure that they're completely accessible. But we teach people how to use a fire extinguisher, how to handle your utilities, like shutting off your natural gas, and then building an emergency toilet. We have other classes as well. For example, our Stop the Bleed program that currently is available for larger organizations or organizations that host large audiences multiple times a year. And we're hoping to get back to where we were pre-COVID, where we were offering the Stop the Bleed class for anybody in the public. These are some different resources for you to just kind of have in your back pocket as where to get information today and also in the event of an emergency. These are the elements that we would be pushing out information, whether it's through, most likely would be radio stations. So some of the things we advocate for an emergency kit, for example, it would be good to have a radio. And it would be even better to have a solar powered radio, because battery lives will drain, power might not be available to charge items. So solar powered anything is going to be an amazing thing to have. But there's also the hand crank. Just keep in mind, if you get something that has a hand crank, for every minute of hand crank is about a minute of talk time or connectivity. And that's kind of what I have for you today. I know it was a lot of information, and I hope a lot of it you're able to turn around and apply it to the work you'll be doing. I mean, I don't expect everyone here to be emergency managers, but these concepts can support any industry. We do this for businesses to help them ensure continuity so they can keep doing the work that they do, even in the event of a worst case scenario. But mostly we try to just reach community members where they are in any form and capacity that they need to hear this information. So thank you so much for having me for the kickoff the series. And I'm happy to help answer any questions you might have. I see there's some in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophia. This was so comprehensive. I really appreciate it. I also was reminded by a family member, so I feel like I need to give a nod to our Alaska attendees that who probably already know this, but yesterday was the 59th anniversary of the Great Alaska 9.2 earthquake. And
Wow.
so we're always remembering that earthquakes happen in all kinds of places. And so I also wondered, given we've got attendees from other areas, is it safe to say that if they were to go to like put in emergency management and their city or their state, that it would get them to a website
Yes.
that would have similar
Yes,
Anything
hands
more you
down.
want to add to that?
Yeah, no, so the system that we follow is a nationwide system as far as response goes, but the same with public education. We try to work really closely within our region. So we're a part of a 5-state region, which includes Alaska. So it's Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So a 4-state region. And so the message that I'm pushing out is actually also the message being taught nationally. And whether you can just Google your city and emergency management, or you can even go to the FEMA's ready.gov website, and they have by state, and then you can get down even further. You could even try your county. So I know in King County has a page that has every city within the county, and it's a link to that city's emergency management office. And you might find that it's not just an emergency management. A lot within emergency management, we wear multiple hats. We're fortunate in the city of Seattle to be our own independent department, but that was a newly developed thing. We used to be in the police department. And so you'll find emergency management offices in fire departments, in police departments, in public works. There are multiple cities here in King County alone where the public works director is the emergency manager, or the sheriff is the emergency manager. That's more seen more often than not in rural communities. So in Eastern Washington, a lot of the surrounding areas where my hometown is, because I make sure to be aware of who's in charge in my home space. The sheriff is the primary emergency manager, but then they have emergency management coordinators that actually do all of the emergency management work. So wherever you are, though, you can definitely just Google your city's name or your county and type emergency management, and you will find, and always go for local government, mostly because those are free resources. There are a lot of contractors out there. There's a lot of public or private industry organizations that exist. They're always vying for jobs here and there, and so yeah. So whether it's a public entity, but for the most part, there's always whether it's a private entity or public, you should be able to find an emergency management office near you.
Great. This is just very, very helpful. Lots of comments about what a great presentation this was. Early on, I received a question from Dan, who mentioned that at least once a year, he's had a patient fall and be pinned in a shower or on the ground overnight. And so in some of these kinds of emergencies, do you have any low-tech solutions that you've seen to address older individuals who live alone?
Well, I know just from my days in the fire department, there's a whole contingency of education for fall prevention. Specifically, I used to have a colleague that we would go out and visit homes and install handrails in the showers where they needed it, install special types of smoke alarms that were for the hearing impaired, so that it wasn't just a sound, but also a flashing light. And so there's definitely resources that exist. I'm not sure of, other than making sure that an individual has some site, like if you live alone, having a call system, whether it's you have something you wear that you have on you at all times. So if you fall in the shower, or having that having the communication today. So if I go more than, and this is just my family, but they're constantly worried about me where I live. So I get checked in on regularly. If I go more than a couple of days without reaching out, I'll have at least 5 different people trying to say, hey, what's going on? How's it going? What's your, like, I saw an incident that happened. Were you involved? So I definitely think just looking at the circumstances of an individual and having that conversation of who are their emergency contacts, what are the ways that they use to reach out, and then what are some ways that they can mitigate. So should something happen, maybe they should have something installed in their restroom, for example. I've been in houses that have phones in their bathrooms, specifically because they live alone and they need to be able to notify in case something happens. My dad falls a lot for different reasons, and so he is never alone. That's not easy for everyone to say, and so I would just advocate to look at the local resources. A lot of fall prevention education comes out of the fire department because it's connected to fire prevention officers. They go around and they'll do home inspections. but the fire department should have some resources more specific as far as, and they might even have programs that they can offer similar to, I worked for Bellevue Fire, which is a city here in King County, and we would have programs where we could go and provide the smoke detectors, the guardrails in the shower installment, and connect these individuals with the programs that already exist for them. It's just a matter of drawing the line, the connection line, because they know they need it, it's there, but they don't know that they have access to it. So sometimes that in itself can mean a world of difference for a person.
Well, I also appreciated you mentioning that should a disaster happen, even if you don't know people very well, if you know there's someone living alone, checking up on them. So that's
Always.
very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I have like,
Jennifer,
oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, I'm sorry. No, I was just gonna say, where I live in an apartment complex, and I like to tell people, if you stand on your front door and you scan from left to right, and this is more for residential areas, the homes in your eyesight are that's your community, that's your immediate neighborhood. And so for apartments, I have 6 units in my stairwell and I'm at the top. So I know my neighbor who recently moved, which is my longest living neighbor. And we were connected so much that we had each other's cell phones. And I know the neighbors, each neighbor below, I always make it a point to introduce myself and let them know what I do for a living. I think those individuals are always really excited to hear that someone like me lives in their building, but I make it a point to know who they are, mostly because I know that I might very well need their help being on the top floor, or they could need my help. And I like to know, there's an older adult with a child and she recently lost her husband, and I know this information. So now, it's in my toolkit. So if something happens, I'm going to check on that neighbor, because we have this relationship established and they've checked on me. So it's a two-way street, really. And so, yeah, I definitely, everyone's community or neighborhood would look different, will look different from anyone else, but now is the time to meet your
Yeah.
neighbors, to be that, because we're already going to be each other's first care providers.
Yeah.
It's just a harsh reality.
So Jennifer mentioned being involved with a tornado that takes out a nursing home with ventilator residents is definitely an experience.
I
She said,
imagine.
we were not prepared for this in Longview, Texas when this occurred. The community learned many lessons with this event. I was wondering if you had anything to add to that, Sophia.
No, just definitely, I know from my tornado experience, I remember it like it was yesterday, and I was little. This is one of my oldest memories, and it was fast. We had a scrolling marquee come across the screen on the TV in seconds. It was gone. The power was out, and we lost our shed that night. And I remember we were in a double wide trailer, and we had to hunker down. And the only place in the trailer, there was only one spot where we could close all the doors and not be surrounded by glass. And just the 4 of us at the time, there was 4 of us, hunkering down until it passed. And the next day, going on my little bicycle throughout my trailer park and looking at the damage, where there was a single wide that was completely burnt to a crisp, which isn't something I would have thought would have happened in a tornado, of a major fire consuming a place. There was another single wide that was tipped over, which I definitely expected to see. But I think when you look at, looking at, especially when you find yourself in your place of work where you're going to be working regularly, we saw during COVID that certain medical facilities or different types of care providing places have different needs. Some places have a higher need for PPE or a higher need for isolation, depending on the event. Some places have an absolute critical need for power. And so if you don't have power, what are the backup systems? So you'll see places if they don't, they should have generators in place, especially large organizations that are assisted living facilities or that have that need. So looking at experiences of the past and making the changes today. So having a backup, either having generators in place, but then also, because generators can only last so long, having a plan in place to be able to transport those that need to maintain power, that need to have equipment on power for whatever the case is definitely something to take with you to wherever you find yourself, and be that proponent for that. There are a lot of laws that exist to support the medical profession in general and the different facets of it. And so I would only just can advocate to keep the memory that you have and let it drive you in the work that you do so that you never have to experience that again. Or those that you take care of don't have to have that fear of, I don't know what's going to happen when they need something. So even just having the conversations today, is how to make it normal, and it's not a scary thing. That's kind of, I hope I didn't scare anybody. Like, I don't want to lead with fear. It's just having the knowledge. I sound like a cliche, but knowledge is power. So having this knowledge can only help make the experience that much smoother for you, or that much less stressful.
Well, it's interesting because that's a perfect segue to something that Millie had said, which is Alaska has an amazing emergency disaster response now as a result of that long ago earthquake. Alaska is super resourceful, but it is true that the lessons learned from the past should be guiding us for things in the future. And she said, thanks so much for your time with the presentation. Cindy asked, do hospitals, nursing homes, and retirement centers take advantage of your expertise in preparedness and drills? In other words, are they tapping into the resources
Yes,
that you offer?
we're regularly getting reached out. Most of the things that we get requested from medical facilities is because there's a mandate that exists in Washington state that medical facilities have to have a emergency plan. And so I get plans sent to me to review. It's not a service that we offer, mostly because we don't have the bandwidth for that. But what I do is ad hoc. Like, if I have time, I'll review a facility's plan and I'll give them feedback. But for the most part, we have people reach out to us because there are templates that exist. So we direct anyone who reaches out to fulfill that mandate. We provide them the templates, we provide them guidance. I used to work for the city of Seattle, or the city of Bellevue, and we would go and visit locations that were like convalescent centers or hospice centers to make sure that they had everything they need as far as evacuation routes highlighted, or if you're multi-level building, how are you going to get people who are who can't walk, for example, or they use wheelchairs, how would they be able to evacuate downstairs when you can't get them in the elevator? And so then those locations invested in contraptions, I don't know how else to call it, but there's this different devices that exist where a person can sit in a chair and someone else can carry them on their back. So there's either that style, or there's stretchers where two people can help carry someone down. But the idea is just that we can all work together, and then you have designated, who's the floor captain, who's going to be the rear and bringing up the tail end of people as we evacuate. But yeah, we definitely have people that reach out to us for guidance and planning. And then I have a variety of businesses, from medical industry to private industry. Like I've done presentations for T-Mobile and Amazon, and these are organizations, the larger they are, most of them have their own emergency support teams, and they just need more guidance on how to work as a team. But we definitely have, I wish more would tap into us, but part of the work that we do is to get our message out there and also get our class offerings more readily available to members of the public, so that they know, whether you live or work in the city of Seattle, these classes are available to everyone. And I even have individuals, they're not a part of a group, but they want to take a class. So if they're not available for something that's already scheduled, I will just call them and have a conversation and guide them through the process. A lot of this information it's easily adopted. It's just, and for someone like me who lives it, even before I became an emergency manager, I lived it. It's common sense to me, but I know now that until you tell someone this stuff, they don't know it. They don't automatically go and think, oh yeah, that's something I need to prepare for. It's just non-existent until they're exposed to it, or if they've lived through it. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And folks, I had mentioned I was going to try to remember to post things in the chat, and I forgot. So I just posted the link to the evaluation survey as well as the link to the handouts and the recording, which should be posted in 24 to 48 hours. And Millie mentioned that they have put Apple HomePods or Amazon Alexa in homes to patients so they can just say, "Hey Siri," and then get help with their
Oh,
emergency contact list.
that's amazing. See, I love hearing stuff like that. That is what I'm talking about. There was a time when I tried to get an app created through grant funding, and it didn't get approved. But just recently, I learned that there is some individuals out of University of Oregon. They created an app called HazAdapt, and right now it's free, so anybody can download HazAdapt, and it gives you generic information, but it's still good information. So we're working on like a community strategy to help promote the app to community members. And then eventually, hopefully, if I get to a point where I have funding, we can become a sponsor. And when you become a sponsor, your specific information can go into the app. So something to think about for UW at a higher level, maybe UW could become a community sponsor. And so then students at UW could download the app and get specific information for their location or for where they, for that organization. But there would be so I'm hoping that the city of Seattle can get to that point. But there's a lot of tools that exist that can help make this more easily digestible by members of the public, especially older adults. And honestly, most of my volunteers, they're all older adults. And even our ham radio operators, I feel like they actually know, and maybe it just comes from experience and wisdom. They know this is the most important. This is the most critical because this is something that will happen in our lifetime. And when it happens, our life will be different for months. And we talk about camping for 2 weeks. Yeah, that's great for the first 2 weeks. And then imagine another 2 weeks and probably another 2 weeks, because it will take time to recover. So anything that we can do today can only make the process that much smoother for ourselves at an individual level, a community level, and then in your case, at a professional level.
Thank you so much. This has just been great, and the chat box is filled with thanks for the great presentation. Reese actually mentioned that in Montana, each county has an emergency management. So I think if you take a look in your area, you're going to find some great resources. And so glad we have Sophia in her office here in Seattle. So
Thank you.
Go ahead. Did you want
Oh, I
to?
was just going to say, here in Washington, so in King County, there are 39 cities, and all of the cities have their own emergency management. But if you go to our neighboring county, Pierce County provides emergency management services for the entire county, with the exception of the city of Puyallup and the city of Tacoma. So out of that whole county, it's the county that is their emergency manager for the majority of the spaces, with the exception of the two largest cities that happen to have funding to have their own office. So yes, you might find that your county, like for me, I live in unincorporated King County. So the county is my primary emergency manager, but lucky for them, I'm my own emergency manager. And so definitely, that's even if that's all you do, at least do that and see who your local provider is. And maybe the next time, summer's coming, there's different cities have different neighborhood building programs. Like when I was in the city of Bellevue, it was the first time I ever learned that a city sponsored block parties, and that residents could have block parties where they have streets closed off, which just still blows my mind, because I've lived here for 7 years now, and I've never lived anywhere that had that concept. And I think it's something that probably happens in more places, and maybe I'm just exposed to it now because I'm a grown up now. But I remember thinking that like the city does that, like cities do that. They have Department of Neighborhoods that are dedicated to building camaraderie and building resilience throughout a community. And so if you happen to have an event, invite your local emergency manager, because they will come and do a dog and pony show. Is that the right phrase? Where they'll, I actually have a little setup right behind me. You can see the natural gas meter. That black box is a fire extinguisher, because I'm doing a workshop tomorrow at the Garfield Community Center here in Seattle. where I'll be teaching those who've registered how to use a fire extinguisher, how to turn off their natural gas, and how to build an emergency toilet, and how to purify water.
Wonderful. Well, and I know you've been pretty busy today, not just with our presentation. So thanks so much. Everyone,
You're
thank you
most
so
welcome.
much for attending. And I will see many of you next week. And feel free to share with others what's coming up. And Sophia, this has just been great. I really appreciate it. See you later, everyone.
Bye.